Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the second part of this. It starts with a birthstone. I'm very pleased to be at the end of February and be able to see Rod again in Connecticut.
Hi, Bruce.
Uh, all right, so I'll just do some brief introductions, and we'll get on to the business. Basically, the business of this is Rod and I, Rod Waterman over there in Connecticut, and myself here in Newcastle, are friends from university back in the 80s who managed to reconnect a few years back and have had numerous conversations about music over the years. And we thought we'd carry it on in this format. Both of us write about music, myself on my blog, which is called It Starts With Birthstone, and Rod for various sort of sites, most recently Pop Matters and so on. And I think that's all we need to know, and we can get started on music. How's your month been, Rod, music-wise? I get the sense that you've been focusing on a particular article and particular record.
Yeah, I have. It sort of works in a strange way with this because you get them, quite a long time in advance sometimes, and so you, in theory, have a chance to listen to them before they officially come out. And so I spent a lot of time, a couple of weeks, I suppose, listening to the new Cloud Nothings album, which I think we're going to talk about, and so when I have to write about something, I sort of listen to it, non-stop until I sort of get the hang of it and then try and understand the shape of the album. And I did that with the Cloud Nothings album, which is an interesting experience with any album, but with their album, because it's quite an intense listening experience. And to play it 5 or 6 times a day for 2 weeks, you sort of start going a little bit mad after a while, but in a good way.
Okay, and you've now got your article done and dusted and so on. And does it often happen that once it's published, you think, oh no, I've changed my mind on this. Can I write something? Can I write a bit more?
I don't usually change my mind about it, but I often wish I'd done it differently or written it differently, or I think of something I wanted to say and I forgot to say, or I sort of have intense waves of self-doubt, but it's not really it doesn't really, it's not about me anyway, so I sort of try and get over myself when it comes to that and just let it go. As long as I think I've been fair, then I can live with that, and I think I was definitely fair about this one. And
Interesting article, definitely.
I mean, yeah, it's out now. It's on Pop Matters. It came out on Friday, the day of release, which was great because sometimes there's a delay, and the Pop Matters site has been migrating to a new platform, so there's been lots of hitches and glitches. But it did come out on time, which was great, and I enjoyed right. I really like the band. I really enjoy them, and I sort of try and get into why that is a little bit in the review. But I like the way that they're really noisy and really melodic at the same time. And they remind me of other bands who used to be like that, like the Jesus and Mary Chain and Husker Du and Nirvana, and also extraordinarily prolific of late as well, because since lockdown, the lead singer, who's basically the brains of the outfit, he does all the songwriting. He put out just an incredible amount of stuff during lockdown. Mostly through Bandcamp. So he definitely used his time very well, which I can't say as much for myself. But yeah, I really, and it's also a half an hour long, basically, this album. So it just hits you over the head for half an hour and then it stops, which is a fun experience. It's sort of cathartic in a way, I thought.
Go on then give a little background of the band and why you liked the record so much.
Well, he is originally from Cleveland. He lives in Philadelphia now. He sort of moved in the last couple of years, and he actually is the partner of Sadie Dupuis, who is in goodness, what's that band called? Can't remember their name, but she put out an album last year called under a name of Sad 13, which was also very good. But so they've been going for about, Cloud Nothings have been going for about just over a decade, and they've put out an album almost on an annual basis. They definitely come out of a punk tradition, I would say, sort of short-ish songs, not much longer than 3 minutes, but always very full of hooks, very melodic, and also lyrically sort of consistent. There's a lot of sort of existential sort of worrying in the songs, and lots of sort of emotional releases, which definitely reminds you of Nirvana, I think, in terms of that sort of primal scream that Kurt Cobain had, that was accompanied by really interesting lyrics and really often very pretty melodies. And I think, I don't know this. I mean, I've not heard Dylan Baldy, the lead singer, talk about this, but it seems obvious that there's a direct line to be drawn from Nirvana to Cloud Nothings. And I think their fans, if you read message boards, definitely sort of refer to Nirvana in the context of why they like Cloud Nothings. But I think this is a kind of album that sounds like, wow, I would love to see this live. It feels like the sort of album that was made to be played in a small room with sweaty people, and I really look forward to the day when we can do that. And I wrote about that in the review. It just feels like they were giving us a live show by proxy or something.
Okay, I'll give my own take on it, which is quite an interesting one. I've spent a lot less time with it than you have because it only came out on Friday. So
Yeah.
I actually put it on early in the morning when I was planning my lessons, and I was feeling rather stressed. And it definitely wasn't what I wanted to listen to at that point. I went through a couple of songs and I was thinking, I've got to plan my lessons and so on. And I was thinking, what am I going to say to Rod about this on Sunday? Rod, I just didn't like this. It was frenetic. It did my head in, and I just wanted to take it off. Can I take it off? So I did actually, and then gave it a listen the next morning when I was a bit calm. I'd got through the day and had a really good night's sleep, and I immediately saw it and heard it a different way.
Huh.
And I liked it more the more I got through to it. I mean, it really did remind me of a lot of stuff, and a lot of American stuff. I think it's very American and very kind of alternative American. So I heard that Husker Du and so on. I heard Buffalo Tom. Occasionally, I heard Superchunk and so on, and a lot of these great alternative American bands. And actually, what it reminded me of towards the end was the Replacements.
Oh,
in
yeah.
that it was in that it's quite ragged in the way that sort of Neil Young would say it, as a kind of compliment rather than a criticism. And I did like it more the more I got through it and
Yep.
so on. And it also made me think about how, with all of those bands, and they're all alternative, but they all represent a kind of work ethic, a kind of American work ethic, because they work very hard
Yeah.
during the making of their songs, and it does seem like a kind of work ethic to me. So strange, such a turnaround, and the important point about music, that you've got to give things a second take, and a lot of it is related to your mood at a certain point in time. Because the first time I listened to it, I thought I never ever want to come back to this again, but the second time I thought it was great.
That's really funny, and it's also very true, and true of the things we're going to talk about today. I think that we can change our minds about things, and initially can really not like them at all, and then eventually sort of realize something about them that sort of strikes a chord with us, or the other way around. I mean, there's albums that I've liked a lot at first and have gone off quite quickly eventually, and thought, well, why did I like that? Or it's not wearing well with me. But the thing I like about Cloud Nothings, one of the things I like, is that they do contain different energies that that come through it. I mean, obviously the noise part is obvious from the start, but the melodies don't necessarily immediately strike you, and they sort of like emerge from that noise, which I think is great. And by the way, the Sadie Dupuis, who Dylan Baldy's partner is, her band is Speedy Ortiz, and I'm sorry I couldn't remember that name immediately, but that's the function of my age.
And I think you don't care for them very much, do you? I remember you being quite negative in the past.
Yeah, I don't love Speedy Ortiz, and it's partly because I think they're too derivative of the 90s to me. It almost feels like they're directly kind of lifting I don't know, certain ticks and tropes from the 90s that I didn't like in the first place. But that might well be very unfair, and I might well need to revisit the Speedy Ortiz catalog. And because I do like Sadie Dupuy's sort of solo thing, Sad 13. I think it's called Haunted Painting, that came out last year. So I might well need to revisit and apologize about my first thoughts about Speedy Ortiz, to be honest. And she's actually primarily a poet and did a creative writing kind of postgraduate degree, I think, as well. So she's very much focused on lyrics, as equally as much, if not more, than the music, because poetry is where she comes from.
But I was pleased that I liked it second time round, because I didn't want to come saying, sorry, Rod, I can't talk about this. I took it off halfway through the second song. But no, it's definitely a record worth listening to. Excellent. Okay, let's move on to something almost as polar opposite as you could possibly imagine. And this was an album that there was quite a lot of anticipation for, and it's got quite rave reviews. This is Arlo Parks, Collapsed in Sunbeams, and it was the Guardian record of the week. And Alex Petridis, who's generally quite an interesting writer, I thought, wrote a sort of interesting review about it. Now, this is a record that I can work to. It's incredibly relaxing and easy to listen to, but I think both of us had slight caveats about it the more we listened to it as the month went on. What was your take on this, Rod?
I mean, I think I came to like it more over time, but I still don't love it. Although I can appreciate it more now after a few weeks of having it in my head. I think it was sort of fated, and sort of a lot because of the lyrics, and I didn't really understand that, because I thought the lyrics were a little bit trite, honestly. But then I sort of thought, well, I'm not the demographic for this necessarily, and it might resonate with people, for whom it is the demographic, because I'm 30 some years older than the person who made it, and the kind of the feelings and experiences that she's talking about may resonate more with somebody who's a lot younger than I am. But it's a beautiful album musically. I really enjoyed it in that way. She's got a really good voice. I love her voice.
She has, and I think there's more to come. I agree with you about the lyrics, about the triteness of them. Now, we have to say to anyone who's listening to this, Rod and I are 55-year-old dried up bitter old men, so listening to this youth and so on, and somebody saying this is a voice of a generation, I just found the lyrics deeply trite, and I'm not going to hold back at this point. I've got diaries of my own from when I was 17, so I understand that. We've been through it and so on, and but there's a lot of empath or thoughts there about her with her friends, and her with her friends in depressive moods. And there's one called Black Dog, where the lyrics are, "You do your eyes like Robert Smith. Let's go to the corner shop and buy some fruit. I'd do anything to get you out of your room." Now, teenage depression is a very
like that, Bruce.
Teenage depression is a very real thing. And so is suicide and everything else. But I do think that too much of Arlo Parks would be a bit much for me. At a certain point, I'd be, "Look, Arlo, will you leave off? I like to feel sorry for me. It makes the boys fancy me." And the likes of that, there's just too much of this kind of empathy. There's too much of this sort of feeling for the world that reminds me of when I was 17. If you'd like to stay on afterwards, Rod. I can read you some selections from my diary, and it's all about how I'm a kind of Holden Caulfield kind of guy, and all the girls at college fancy me when they quite self-evidently do not, and so on. And I did think a lot of this with the lyrics going through the Arlo Parks. Perhaps I'm being a little bit brutal, but it did seem a little bit of that kind of surface that we all have at that age and so on. And making a lot of fuss about things that aren't really worth making a lot of fuss about. Come on, you're from a nice middle class family, and you're going to get called down to tea in a minute. So I have to say that I have to say exactly what I felt about it going through the month, because that came more and more to the surface. But it's so easy to listen to.
Yeah.
But she's definitely a talent. It's really relaxing to listen to if you let the lyrics go, I'd say. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I definitely think it sounds great, and if you just tune out the lyrics, it's great. But I think if attention is being drawn to the lyrics, then I sort of then I force myself to pay attention to them, and I don't really want to dress up like Robert Smith and go and buy any fruit. Thank you. Not going to cheer me up at all. I feel like an idiot. I feel worse about myself if I'm down the shops dressed up like Robert Smith trying to buy a mango. I feel like a clown.
So that kind of cultural referencing was going through, and that's very much what you do at that age.
Yeah,
empathizing with characters in films or with books and so on. But it wasn't. I had to say, it wasn't ironically done. I think they were quite sincere, the lyrics. So we really are a pair of bitter and nasty old men, aren't we? And perhaps we'd better leave her alone.
Sorry, Arlo. No offense.
She'll be all right, I imagine. Okay, so at this point, we move on to the third, a very, very high-profile album this month, very high profile. Was given sort of album of the month in several magazines and so on, and was really pushed forward as perhaps the most prominent big artist record this year. That's the Weather Station's Ignorance. And I know from my conversations with you earlier on in the month that you were immediately quite taken with this, Rod. So could you go ahead and say why that was?
I absolutely love this album, Bruce. And I'd heard Weather Station, the Weather Station before, and liked. I think the last album might have been called Loyalty. I think, but there's been a big leap, I think, forward with this album. She was more of a folky kind of artist before, and this is kind of just a giant step into a different kind of thing altogether, and it's going to sound strange, but the band it reminded me most of was Talk Talk, and their later phase where Mark Hollis got kind of experimental and jazzy with like Spirit of Eden and then his solo stuff. And I heard a lot of that kind of vibe on this album, and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous album. Very kind of sort of oblique musically and lyrically, sort of sounds really kind of abstract, jazzy. You think of sort of that sort of later period Joni Mitchell, perhaps, as well as a benchmark or a comparison. If you're looking for something, it sort of sounds a bit like. It also has this wonderful way of doing two things at once, because it feels like an album about a relationship, but I think it also, based on something I read in an interview, I think it was in the New Musical Express. It's about the environment and the sort of and the climate crisis that we're obviously in. So it manages to be about a personal thing and a micro thing and a macro thing at the same time, which is very clever. And it's just marvelously well done. And the other thing I'll say about it is that I wanted to read the lyrics because I was curious as to exactly what she was saying and how it was working. And her website, has all the lyrics for the whole album, and they're just printed as a block for each song. They're not in lines like you would expect to see. So they're not lyrics so much as they're almost like prose poems, which is an interesting thing to see because the way that she manages to sing those words as if they are lines and lyrics, but they're actually paragraphs, is kind of brilliant, I think. And it sort of seems to be the way that the album works. It doesn't work in conventional song structures. And I just think it's a tour de force. It's my favorite album of the year so far, I think by quite a distance.
I could definitely understand that. I mean, as soon as I started listening to it, I thought this is obvious quality. Sometimes you just feel this, that this is obviously a talent and she's got something to say. I found it more easier to admire than to love quite a while. And I actually wrote my own impressions of it. What I quite like about writing a blog is that I don't have to go to an editor. I just write what I think and then just print it. And I have a number of quite ridiculous theories about music that kind of come up, and I don't have an editor to say that's complete nonsense. We're not printing that, which is why I like the blog thing. So what I was taken at, there are so many solo female artists at the moment, so many of the best records every year in the last few years I've found have been by solo female artists. True. And some of them are quite distinct, but some of them I've thought you could park into camps of two particular influences, and that's essentially Joni Mitchell and Kate Bush. And I find so many records, I think, well, it's not exactly like Joni Mitchell, but it's that way of thinking and the distinction between those two. Joni Mitchell's really quite intellectual, quite a cerebral artist, whereas Kate Bush is pure emotion and sensuality. And I definitely put myself, in terms of my preferences, in the Kate Bush camp. I mean, I know how good Joni Mitchell is. It's blatantly obvious. I can remember actually you a couple of years ago when Dylan got the Nobel Prize, sort of said they could have given it to Joni or they could have given it to Leonard. And I understand that completely.
I still believe that.
But they really are albums of that kind of stature. I don't think it's probably a good idea if they do keep giving it to people like that, because it all pissed Philip Roth off so much, didn't it? Because he was in line when Dylan got it, and someone went to interview her and he said, "Who've they given it to this year? Peter, Paul, and Mary?" Right? But I understand that about Joni, and there's definitely that feeling. They're both Canadian. So there's definitely that feeling about this. And I finally had a real breakthrough on it last night when I was thinking. I had a couple of beers, which always help. But I just listened to it and thought, this is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Incredibly powerful. You know?
Yeah, I find it very moving. And I got out my copy of Spirit of Eden by Talk Talk this week to see if I was right about the sound kind of palette comparison that I had in my head, and it did sound quite similar. Although I was also reminded about how weird Talk Talk got toward the end. They became so much more than a pop group that they sort of became famous for being, and he just went off into this very strange direction, which is great actually. It was very, very jazzy, but I think that's a really interesting point about the Joni Mitchell Kate Bush kind of fork, with contemporary female artists. And I'm starting to think about sort of one of my favorites, which is Sharon Van Etten, and I don't know where she would go in that sort of lottery, because I think she's a bit of both in a way.
She's got quite a lot of Springsteen, Sharon Van Etten.
Lately she has, yeah, for sure. That 17 song was very much that kind of way, wasn't it? But yeah, the Weather Station album is just, I think you can sort of drown in that in a good way. It's sort of something you can just sort of let it just wash all over you and just really kind of, get lost in it. It's quite beautiful, I think.
I agree with you. And it kind of, to some way, I was kind of resisting it. And we'll come back to this on when we get onto our canon conversation, which we're going to have a little bit later, because
Mhm.
I kind of resist things I'm told to like. You must listen to this; it's great, and I'm a bit sulky on that one. I'm saying, well, I don't want to. I don't like being told what to like and
Right.
told what's good. You know what I mean. You know what I mean.
Oh, I absolutely do. And I didn't read Love in the Time of Cholera for 15 years because everybody on the tube was reading it. I was like, I'm not reading that. I'm not a sheep. And
We're
then I read
definitely
it,
not. We're
and I was like,
definitely
well, that was disappointing. What was all the fuss about?
It's- oh well, let's move on to the next anyway. So thumbs up again and so on. And I'm actually in agreement that that probably is the best record I've heard this year, although I still don't entirely love it, but I'm definitely going to keep coming back to it. It's a remarkable record. Okay, so the fourth one here is something quite different, and it's the new Tindersticks album, which is Distractions. Now, Tindersticks have been around for a very, very long time, since the early 90s, when they released their first eponymous album, which was a double album, which was at the time I can remember was given Melody Maker Album of the Year, which actually meant something at that point in time. Now, I was curious when I brought this one up, Rod, that you're not particularly familiar with them. You've never really listened to them over the years.
No, I know the name, but I've never. This is the first Tindersticks album I've ever listened to, um, and so I didn't know what to expect. But I mean, you can go ahead and give your thoughts on it.
Okay, I've liked them very much, some fairly much over the years. They've never been a favourite of my band. I liked them very much when they first come out because they're kind of defined by their singer. Stuart Staples, who's definitely very much a Marmite kind of vocalist. Absolutely. The bands themselves are generally quite tasteful and inventive in terms of their arrangements. There's some kind of orchestral sweep to what they do. But it's very much about Stuart Staples, who's the singer, and I assume the lyricist. And I liked his way of writing lyrics at the time because it's quite a 20s mindset that he has in that way that towards the end of your 20s, a lot of us struggle. A lot of us aren't getting to where we want to be in life in terms of our status or in terms of relationships, struggling relationships, and so on. And that album really quite spoke to me at the time. But now, 30 years later, they tend to make the same record all the time to a certain degree because Staples hasn't got the most enormous range. If you thought of somebody who you'd compare him to, I think it would be Scott Walker. And I
Hmm,
think they're quite influenced by Scott Walker. But being
interesting.
influenced by Scott Walker is quite a dangerous thing to take on because
Yeah,
Scott Walker is incomparable. And
yeah, you're
I
right.
can think of very, very few people who I thought have taken on that Scott Walker thing and been able to pull it off. Perhaps Julian Cope is the only person I could think of. And Julian Cope's apparently went off Scott Walker. He put out an album of his stuff and brought him back to public attention. But this Tindersticks one, and I've been talking for a bit, so I'll pass over the baton to you. I enjoyed this new album, but it was the thing about Staples that still gets me because I do kind of think, come on, Stuart, you should have moved on in terms of your emotions a bit from when you were 28 by now. Life cannot be this dreadful, bleak point of failure all the time. It's got a bit more to offer than that. But so go on. What was your take on this, Rod?
Well, obviously, Bruce, he needs to get himself down the shops and buy some fruit. That'll sort him right out.
It's self pity, lot of self pity, and kind of ennui. And we all like a lot of art that's related to that. But you would hope that artists would broaden out a little bit in terms of their kind of perspective, because it's a little bit odd to still have really pretty much the same take 30 years after you start, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I tried to like it. I mean, I'm still trying to like it. I'm still playing it. I was just a bit bored, honestly. Um, and I think if you're going to do spoken word or whatever it is, which he sort of more or less does on that first song, which is quite a long song, those words sort of need to be interesting. And I couldn't really understand what he was saying, but I wasn't compelled enough to sort of like kind of like lean in and listen. But I do keep going back to it. It sort of felt to me like this is like almost like, okay, let's make a record where it sounds like John Cale is doing a record with Radiohead. And I was like, well, that's an interesting idea, but like the Scott Walker thing, it's a high wire act. It's a high risk, high reward sort of situation, and you've got to be able to pull it off. And I'm not entirely sure they did. Another interesting thing I thought is that, like another band we're going to talk about, there's a Neil Young cover on here, and I thought it was an interesting choice. They do "A Man Needs a Maid," which is a very problematic song. And I didn't quite, when I was younger and I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's a lovely song. You know, it's romantic. But I was sort of young and stupid and chauvinistic, and I might still be some of those things, not young, but still the other two. A Man Needs a Maid is, you know, it's not without its difficulties. I mean, it sort of seems to be saying, you know, well, somebody needs a person needs a partner in life. Okay, fair enough. But a maid? I mean, you mean like someone to clean up after you? And so it's not maybe not the best choice of Neil Young cover. On the other hand, they do a nice job of it. I just wonder why they chose that one, and if they were trying to reinvent and reimagine it, and that's why they chose it. But it's the sound textures are very nice on that cover, I thought.
I think I like the covers on there. I think possibly the reason they did it is it's very much within Stuart Staples' persona. He's got
Uh-huh.
this persona as a kind of Lothario, as a
I
kind of
see.
ladies' man. And then it does fit in with that kind of persona which he's established over the years. I very much like the covers. I like that one. I like the one they did of Dory Previn. Do you know Dory Previn?
I
Uh,
don't know. That's another gap.
you should. You should. She's a very, very interesting songwriter from the 70s. She was married to Andre Previn,
Oh.
and the classical composer and arranger. And she was married to him, and he went off with Mia Farrow.
Oh,
And
right.
Dory Previn itemized the whole process in great detail and great pain. She's a very, very interesting singer songwriter, and she's not quite like anybody else. If you see pictures of her, she's this middle-aged lady with enormous great glasses, and you think, well, that's sort of how are you going to get onto the cover of Rolling Stone looking like that, and so on. But her songs are really, really quirky and interesting, so I'd recommend that to everybody. But back to Tindersticks anyway. I thought it was a solid album, and I liked it, and so on. I always like the arrangements of the band, always do, but it's a bit Staples to me, and he sort of sometimes is you wonder, is he playing it straight, or is it black comedy, or is it
Mm.
a kind of farce? And I'm never entirely sure, and he kind of falls over the line quite a bit. He hasn't got quite the voice he needs to pull this off, I think. That I like the persona, and I probably like a lot of the paperbacks that they read too. I like that kind of existential sort of 50s thing, and so on, which they seem to kind of play on, or a little bit of kitchen sink films of the early 60s and so on.
Right.
The stuff Morrissey went through. That's where they come from. So I liked it without loving it, and so on. And I can change my mind listening to the record because I kind of think a bit, oh, pull yourself out of it, Stu, for goodness sake. You know, this is ridiculous for a man.
Have a bit of fruit, mate.
We've got a recurring theme here. Okay, let's move on to the next. And this was a choice of yours, Hand Habits, who's a project of a woman called Meg Duffy, who I think is based in New York. Tell us about this one, Rod.
Well, it's an EP, so it's only 3 songs, but it's I thought very powerful, and I'm a big fan of Hand Habits. I mean, we were talking before we were started recording about the last album, Placeholder, which is a phenomenal album, and I reviewed that when it came out, and I absolutely loved it. She's really interesting, or I should say they. That's her preferred pronoun, I believe. They're a really interesting artist. Worked a lot before going solo as the sort of the guitarist, for example, for Kevin Morby in studio and on tour, and so sort of definitely kind of paid their dues, if you want to use that old phrase, before going solo. A little bit like St. Vincent, did, playing in other bands before going their own way. But it's 3 songs. One I think is just a brand new song, the first one, and then the second one is another Neil Young cover, I Believe in You, which they do a tremendous job of, I think. And then the third song, I think, is a remix of something that maybe is from Placeholder. But so it goes by fast, but I just immediately want to start playing it again as soon as it's over. It's just the sounds that they get out of that guitar are just amazing, and I think I'm really interested to see what comes next from them, because it feels like that Hand Habits is on a really interesting trajectory for me.
I think they're a very interesting band. I took the opportunity to listen to the album from a couple of years ago. What's it called? Placeholder.
Yeah.
And I'd forgotten how good it was. There's something really otherworldly about her voice. And it's interesting that she does Neil Young, because Neil Young is quite an otherworldly kind of presence there too, and so on. I think it's interesting doing covers of Neil Young. I mean, there's songs from the early 70s. They're such solid songs. They're like tables that will last forever. Essentially, they're so incredibly crafted. But I do wonder about the sentiments. As you said, they're very, very early 70s sentiments. And I think the same goes for I Believe in You. It's just Neil Young and that Back to the Garden thing after Woodstock and so on. I wonder whether, I mean, I can listen to Neil Young albums from the early 70s, no problem at all. But the sentiment seems so much of their time and place to me, actually.
Yeah. It's interesting that 2 of the bands we're talking about chose to cover Neil Young songs. I wonder what's in the air or in the water that he's sort of becoming the flavor of this year for bands who are looking back to music history. That he's having his moment again somehow.
Well, I mean, like
catalog, enormous amount of money, didn't he?
Yes, might have done. But I mean, these songs, like I say, they're so eternal. Essentially, it's the sheer simplicity of them, and I think they're 2 decent covers. Actually, I quite like them both. I wasn't so keen on the affected vocal on the 3rd track. I have a bit of trouble with that kind of. I don't know what the word would be, but you see it quite a lot of treating the vocals almost kind of in a kind of dance way. Yeah. And I know Bon Iver did that a couple of albums ago, and I just couldn't listen to it. Actually, it's just something that but the other two songs on it I really went for. What's your take on? Where I'm coming from on that one? Yeah.
Oh, I do. I really don't like it either. I mean, I forgive Hand Habits because I like them so much, but that was the point in Bon Iver's career where I just stopped listening to him, because I hate that vocal tick that you get with the auto tune or the vocoder or whatever it's called. I really dislike it, and it just irritates me to no end.
I suppose it's brave, and kind of Tame Impala in some degrees have gone a similar way to go a bit mainstream, and it is brave of an artist. But from my perspective, perhaps I'm a little bit traditional in that respect, that they kind of lost what I found special about them in the first place, actually, at that point.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's I think it's the opposite of brave in some ways because you're sort of hiding behind an effect rather than letting your own vocal sort of shine through. And I prefer to hear someone's actual voice than a thing that makes you sound like everybody else or makes you sound like some kind of machine, which I don't love. I sound like an old fogey, but I don't like
We
it.
are old fogies, Rod. We are. Let's
I
face
suppose
it.
so. I suppose we are.
Okay, let's move on now. We've got 20 minutes left. I would just mention a few other albums that I did quite like this month. There's one called Sticky Fingers by Albertine Sarges, who seems to be based in Berlin, which is a very odd and original record. It sort of reminds me a bit of the Slits and some of that sort of interesting female side of post-punk, but it's highly original, and I'd recommend anybody listening to that. The Rats on Rafts one got quite a lot of publicity if you're into sort of Rotterdam bands doing dystopian albums and so on. I'm sure there's an audience for that out there somewhere.
Sounds
And so
very
I'm
niche.
quite an say again, Rod.
Sounds very niche.
There's CJ Lewis, which is quite a nice dance album, which also got album of the week, called Time. Something I've noticed at the moment. Why do so many bands have small letters rather than capitalizing words in titles? Could you tell me that, Rod? What's going on?
Well, of course, I'm the authority on this kind of thing, Bruce. So you've come to the right place. I think it began as a sort of a statement around identity politics quite a long time ago, but I don't know if that's why it's still happening.
Good for you. Good for you. You actually have an answer. I thought I was putting you on the spot here, and you'd say, "I don't know. Get on with it." But you actually. That's a great answer. That's a great answer. Okay, I think we need to move on because we're getting into our last 20 minutes. In terms of a subject that I thought about for discussion in this mid phase, I remember when we were at university and I asked you about this and you didn't quite recall the moment, but I can remember in our first year, NME, which was like a Bible to us when we were there. NME was still very good in the mid-80s. The writing was good and it was a good time for music. And the NME actually published a list of 100, their list of the 100 best albums ever made. And now it's something that people do all the time. And it's a constant thing. But the NME didn't do it that often at that point in time. They did it every 5 years or so. And I do remember that we pored over the list and so on, because we were like that at that point in time. But you can't recall this at all, Rod. What was your take anyway on the list when you had a look at it, when I sent it to you?
Yeah, I mean, my failing memory is a thing that's kind of becoming more prominent of late. So that's another story. But no, I don't remember it at all. But then you sent me a link and I went and looked at it, and I was struck by a couple of things. And it's obviously a conversation about what we're calling the canon, right? About things that get sort of admitted to the pantheon of great music. And I have a few thoughts about that. One of them is that the lists are made at a certain point in history, so they're inflected by the time when they're made. And so this list has a ton of Elvis Costello albums in it. Fine. I like Elvis Costello, but, they did that list again 8 years later, and all of those albums were gone. So, I mean, the canon is supposed to be something sort of enduring, and if you're going to put something in there, it needs to stay there or didn't need to be in there in the first place. So there's a lot of albums from around the time the list was made, which may not have stood the test of time. There's canonical bands who I really despise, right? Like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. I hate all of those bands with a passion, as I think you know. I loathe them. Like I'm coming through your screen with my distaste for those bands.
which I always
So I
think is
never have liked
interesting.
sort of canonical bands. I've always liked the sort of the second tier of bands more for some reason, which is some kind of psychological problem I have. And the other thing that's conspicuous here is that there are so few women on the list. And
Joni is there, isn't she? She's got a couple of
there, I
albums.
think. And Susie and the Banshees album on there. I mean, what is that? I mean,
All
that's
coming
not
to the
a canonical
surface.
album.
It's all coming to the surface. I thought it was a great list. Now, the top 10 I thought is really interesting.
Yeah,
So, number one album, What's Going On, Marvin Gaye. Number two album, Astral Weeks by Van Morrison.
yeah,
Now, I'm quite happy to have those as the best albums ever made. Truly visionary,
yep.
incredible sounding albums that are right out there and so on. And I would be quite happy to see lists where they are numbers one and two every single time. It's much more interesting than nowadays you get OK Computer and Revolver. Now I do like the Beatles, but I don't like these sort of canon things that have four Radiohead albums and four Beatles ones,
Right.
and then perhaps something like Arcade Fire. It's dull, and
Yeah.
I find this album, this list, really interesting. It's got Gang of Four. It's got Pere Ubu. It's about the 28th best album ever made. Now I like that. If you've heard that album, it's got a final song where they just smash plates up for 8 minutes, and
Well,
I think, wow, that's great. They've got all of those things in there. They've got both Suicide albums in there. They've managed to sort of shoehorn all great black artists by putting in their greatest hits, which is a bit of a cop-out, really.
Yeah.
Smokey Robinson and Al Green and so on, and then Buddy Holly and so on. But I actually think if you took those 100 albums and you had those, you'd have a pretty damn good record collection, and you could give away the Beatles and Susie and the Banshees one. But I'd pretty much take the whole lot, except for Trout Mask Replica, which I really can't stand.
I've never.
And I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, here's another interesting thing: is that they did this list again in 1993, and by that point, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys was number one, and Revolver by the Beatles was number two, and Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols had moved up from 13th in 1985 to number 3 in 1993. It got better over 8 years, like 10 places. And the album is like, that's not even a good album, let alone a canonical album. It's like pub rock.
It's an important album. It's an important album, and I like the singles, but I've got the album, but I never ever listen to it. It's for what it represents, But you can already see with that case, those two, Pet Sounds and Revolver, things ossifying a bit. And it's interesting what's happened with the list since, that all the stuff that's come in, you've got to have, I suppose, Nirvana in there, you've got to have the Stone Roses.
Right.
Then as you go through the 90s, for some reason, everybody's decided you've got to have Neutral Milk Hotel, which is a little bit of a wonder to me. You've got to have those Radiohead ones. You've got to have Arcade Fire. And now I suppose you've got to have the most significant sort of R&B hip hop artists. You've got to have Kendrick in there. But otherwise, it's kind of ossified, and you have all these Beatles stuff and this and that. I think this is a much, much more interesting list. I think it's much more interesting, and I doubt very much whether it was actually voted for. I think they decided it together on committee of what needs to be in there. But like I said, I'm very happy if Astral Weeks and What's Going On are the best two albums ever made, because those albums are both right out there, and they're still right out there. They're crazy inventive genius records, both of them. You know.
I have no problem with that either. My biggest issue of the list of all is the fact that there are so few women on it, and I think that doesn't change over time either. And when they revisit this in '93, it still has very few women on it. And Patti Smith's Horses have dropped by about 10 places in the intervening period, which is astonishing to me because I think that album should be number 3. If you're having What's Going On and Astral Weeks is 1 and 2, I think Horses could easily be number 3.
It's a boys chart, isn't it? Yeah. It's a boys chart. Patti's not in the top 10, but Marquee Moon is. I don't know many women who like television. I really don't. They're a boys band. Yeah. They're a boys band. But at the same time, they've got Swordfish Trombones as the 7th best album ever made. I think that's just terrific.
Yeah, that doesn't stay around for the next one either, does it?
Oh, absolutely. Swordfish Trombones, I think it would be barely mentioned in great albums, but it did sound so weird and out there when it came out. It sounded, and that's what I'm saying. They've got some really, really out there records there. They've got the 2 Suicide albums are both in there, you know, and I kind of like it, and But and it's not so predictable as things are. It is something that I find you are supposed to like certain things now. Yeah. And I don't like that kind of conformity. And I take your point about the lack of women artists, and that is a great failing. But that was a little bit the world that it was there. It must have been very difficult to be a female journalist, even at that point in time, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if it's too much easier now, honestly, but you know, it's very interesting.
Okay, any more things you want to get off your chest about the canon?
I think I've vented enough for one day.
Very funny, very funny. In terms of the canon, I'm pretty much like everything, and I pretty much understand why it's there. I've got Beatles albums, and I've got Stones albums, and I've got Led Zepp albums, and I don't of all of them, I prefer the Beatles to the bunch of them. But I think Oasis did the Beatles an enormous disservice. Frankly, I mean, if you look at this chart, there are 2 or 3 Beatles albums in there. And that's it. There's no need to put Sgt. Pepper, which isn't a very great record, to be honest, in there, and so on. And I think all of that sort of ossifying of the canon, I think Oasis played a dreadful role in all that, actually, you know.
Yeah, well, like somebody else said, Manchester, so much to answer for, right?
Okay, let's move on anyway to our final section. And as with last time, I thought we'd do a couple of RIPs, and there are a couple of very notable people who've passed this month. First of all, Chick Corea. Now, I'm not a particular expert on jazz. I'm vaguely aware of Chick Corea. What I know most of all is that he played on Bitches Brew. But he was a bit of a divisive musician, I think. And you know a fair bit more about this than me, so perhaps you could say something, Rod.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't claim to be an expert or anything like that, but Chick Corea is a really interesting figure in jazz because he sort of came along at a time when jazz was really changing, and he was partly responsible for changing it. I think he's one of the sort of leading lights in sort of jazz, what came to be called jazz fusion. So he was a pianist, but he played the electric piano as well as the standard piano, and so he was part of that period of Miles Davis's career when he was transitioning to that very out there avant-garde electric stuff that he did. So Chick Corea was sort of part of that wild quintet that Miles kind of formed around 68, 69 that became Bitches Brew in a Silent Way, and then all that just insane stuff that came after it, which is sort of bridges my sort of favorite phase of Miles Davis in a way. And Chick Corea plays on, I think in my favorite Miles Davis album is actually a relatively lesser known album called Fida Kilimanjaro. And that's an interesting album because it has two different quintets on it, one of which has Chick Corea and the other of which has Herbie Hancock. And Chick Corea plays on, I think, 2 of the 5 songs on the album, and they're some of my favorite Miles Davis songs. Fallon Brun is the opening song of the album, and that's what Chick Corea plays on. And it's just a beautiful album and a beautiful song. But he is divisive because jazz fusion was written off for a long time as sort of a failed attempt to make jazz kind of more like rock or something. But I think it stands up better than one might have expected it to. Although some of it is a bit noodly, I would say. He did a lot of things. He had a lot of projects, a lot of different collaborators. He started off as a standard kind of jazz kind of pianist, and then he sort of became more experimental. He founded the band called Return to Forever, who did a few albums that were interesting. Again, very sort of like stretched out electric jazz, which isn't for everybody even still. But I definitely think he's an important figure in jazz. He is interesting also because, like Keith Jarrett, he's one of those people who, if you hear him on some of his live albums or even on his studio albums, you can hear him singing along to himself, which some people find off-putting. I find it quite funny. So you can hear that the piano's going and he's going, and the mic picks it up, which is quite funny. But I think he's done some really, interesting things that are worth exploring. There's a project called Circle that's worth listening to. His first album is more like straight ahead jazz, definitely worth listening to. And the Miles Davis stuff is just astonishing. So
that's wonderful. I think I can add nothing to that at all. Okay, but I'll add one of my own. Sort of about midway through the month, I was sort of working from home, and the news came on. I think I saw it on the BBC that Mary Wilson of the Supremes had passed in her 70s. And I wrote something from my blog immediately, and it's a curious one of passing when somebody like that from such a fabulous band comes on. Of course, I just got a Supremes greatest hits record out and put it on. And I just felt like punching the air and sort of dancing around, and somebody's passed. But in some ways, that's quite a wonderful thing and a wonderful tribute to all of that fabulous, fabulous Motown music of the 60s and 70s, which is just incomparable. You could play hundreds and hundreds of great tracks, and the Supremes were probably say the biggest of all those bands. And generally, I don't necessarily like what's on top of the charts, but those Supreme singles are just fabulous right the way through. They're just the sound and the energy and the romance and the melody. And it was interesting that I think both of us, when we thought about it, we actually thought of some of the post-Diana Supreme singles when it was perfect. It was very, very political. Berry Gordy and Diana got together. Initially, he renamed them as Diana Ross and the Supremes, which is very, very galling for the other two in the band. It's just, okay, you're backing status now. And Berry Gordy really wasn't interested in the Supremes after Diana left. And they carried on through Mary Wilson's force of personality, I think. And some of the very, very best singles are from that period. Stoned Love and Up the Ladder to the Roof and Artificial Sunshine is that. There are so many that if I go on and I want to put a Supremes record on, I'll choose it from that era, that time when Motown was just getting so funky and it was getting socially conscious and it was getting environmentally conscious. I listened to Floyd Joy, an album of theirs from that time, and it's incredible. Yeah. Everybody should hear it. Everybody should hear some of those, and they're written off as singles artists, which you understand, but they did some really, really good albums. So, sorry, I've spoken for a while. I think your kind of impression was fairly similar.
Oh, I completely agree with everything that you said about that. And I mean, I love the Diana Ross and the Supreme stuff. I thought it was great. And now, growing up, you hear it all the time. Everyone's parents had those albums or those singles collections. But it is really amazing to think about how good the Supremes were when Diana Ross left. It was almost like they were liberated from, having to be her backing singers, basically, and they became a real kind of they almost like they became a band. And Jean Terrell came in, and I think she was the lead singer, maybe for some of that stuff or all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, Up the Ladder to the Roof is an astonishing song. I mean, I still, every time I hear that song, it's like I'm hearing it for the first time. And there's that moment towards the end where the song just explodes, and I still get the same reaction every time I hear it. It's amazing. And I discovered, and I think we talked about this a little bit online somewhere when Mary Wilson died, they did an album with Jimmy Webb, which is amazing. And there's that insane Joni Mitchell cover, All I Want, I think it's called, which when you first hear it, it sounds like Can or something, but with horns. And it's like, what is going on? It's an amazing thing. And the Supremes are just, they could not be rated highly enough for me. I think they're a phenomenal band.
I thought it was rather sad. I did find the tributes rather sad from Berry Gordy and from Diana Ross as well. This is someone whose story is so deeply entwined with yours, and the comments they made were rather soulless and rather corporate, and kind of. I found them quite sad and so on. Come on, give her a bit of respect for the contribution, and I found them a bit comments from behind gated walls, I have to say, but this is the Motown story to a large degree, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I didn't see those comments, but I can imagine what they might have been, sort of bland and not particularly full of feeling.
It didn't seem particularly heartfelt, but not to end on a sad note. Go and get your Supremes' greatest hits on and put it on. It's just song after song. I loved every single song on that greatest hits.
Yeah,
How many artists can you say that for? I love all of their hits.
Yeah.
How remarkable! How remarkable. Absolutely. Okay, so R.I.P. Mary Wilson. And at that point, I think that sums it up. We're just over an hour, Rod. We've spoken for an hour very easily, and the second one is in the can. Yep. So many, many thanks. I think we said something beforehand about this. I'd like to sort of dedicate this very small endeavour to a dear friend of both of ours from university days, who's been proper poorly recently, and we've only just heard about it. So all our very, very best wishes to Howard. Here's something for you to listen to, and get well soon, mate. Special friend indeed. Yeah.
Lots of love, Howard. Have some fruit.
Brilliant. At that point, I will stop the recording. Thanks a million, Rod. Excellent.
Thanks, Bruce.